Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, a dancer is determined to get back her adopted son in a story of passion, movement, and flamethrowers in Pablo Larraín's Emma. Dancer Emma, played by Mariana de Girolamo, and her choreographer husband Gaston, played by Gael, Garcia, Bernal, give their adopted son Polo, played by Kristen Sarez, back to the state after an incident where Polo set Emma's sister on fire and disfigured her. In the aftermath of these events, Emma and Gaston's relationship begins to disintegrate and Emma strikes out on her own as she begins to dance to reggaeton and is determined to get Polo back, no matter how. Emma, not to be confused with the recent Jane Austen adaptation, is the latest film from Chilean director Pablo Larraín, probably best known to English language audiences for the Natalie Portman film Jackie. Larraín's been keeping himself plenty busy during lockdown though, as he managed to corral a whole bunch of filmmakers to make shorts for Netflix under the series Homemade. He also announced that he's going to be working on a film about Princess Diana called Spencer that will star Kristen Stewart. But Larraín is already well known to art house audiences, especially if they followed his work from Chile, which is often influenced by the history and politics of the country, like the movie No about the referendum and the biopic of the poet Pablo Neruda, both of which starred Gael Garcia Bernal, who were teams with him for this movie. Apparently Emma was at least partially inspired by the student protests in Chile last year. This film was meant to have a very small theatrical release before it arrived on Mubi, but of course that was obviously cancelled due to COVID-19, so Mubi had a free preview open to all when it first arrived on their service, and then it was obviously put behind their paywall. I watched it when it was freely available back in May, and yeah, I've kind of taken my sweet time getting to this review. Sorry. At the centre of this movie is a fantastic performance by Mariana de Girolamo as the title character. Emma is in virtually every single scene of this movie, and de Girolamo is immediately gripping and compelling right from the outset. We look upon her and we go, who is that? And what are they doing? And that's quite an accomplishment considering that Emma is a very difficult character to pin down. You're never quite sure what she's going to do next. Her motivations are fairly ambiguous, and she's also quite dislikable. Her actions are fairly detestable. She is manipulative and controlling, and clearly she has some kind of ulterior motive that she is determined to get to no matter what. But despite this, de Girolamo always holds our attention. I think one of the things that's most immediately striking about Emma is her hair, her peroxide blonde hair, and that's part of a recurring motif that is meant to evoke flames and fire with the character of Emma. This is very much established with the character's dance introduction. She does an elaborate routine in front of a back projection of the sun, and also we establish that the character is a massive pyromaniac. She goes around going with a flamethrower, just setting fire to things like street lamps. In fact, the very first image in the film is Emma staring at a traffic light that she has just recently set on fire and just watching it burn. That image sets up this idea of selfish, destructive catharsis that very much embodies the character, but also the idea that Emma is not a person you want to get close to, because if you do, you get burned. And she ruins everyone that she comes into contact with over the course of this movie and seems to revel and enjoy that. Maybe that's why she sticks around as much as she does with Gaston, played by Gael Garcia Bernal, in spite of the fact their relationship being dysfunctional at best. If you remember Bernal in erotically charged films like Your Mama Tambien way back when, it might be a little bit of a shock to the system seeing him now play the older, inadequate man. Gaston is a former dancer now turned choreographer, and it's sort of implied that he's become that because he can't keep up with the routines anymore, especially because we establish that Gaston is impotent. Emma memorably describes him as a human condom. So there's this linkage between dance and sex. Very early on in the movie, it's implied that he can't dance anymore and he can't satisfy Emma anymore. And that doesn't help because there is a very large age gap between Emma and Gaston, which is part of the reason why their relationship is so turbulent. Gaston is starting to age, and Emma is young and still vivacious and still feels like she has something more to prove and feels stifled by their relationship. And it's clear that in the aftermath of what has happened with Pablo, things have become incredibly toxic between them, and now they are trading really nasty barbs at each other. And Bernal is very good in this movie. His Gaston is very quiet and reserved. It seems to be his way of dealing with the trauma of what's happened. He's more passive-aggressive towards Emma until occasional moments where he just spikes into outright antagonism. And some of the best moments in this film are the arguments between those two characters, especially once Emma strikes out on her own. Once Emma asserts her independence, she's free to explore herself and her sexuality, and that character's journey really manifests itself in the dance sequences all throughout. It's a tremendously physical performance from Girolamo, which is only more commendable when you realise that she's not actually a dancer. She merely practiced for this role, but I was totally convinced she was all throughout this movie. You really get to see the change where Emma starts out as being part of this very highly choreographed ensemble, and then she starts doing reggaeton, which is characterized as being very dangerous and sexualized, but also very individualistic. In that, you really get a sense of the body movement and really kind of how very aggressive it is as a routine at the same time. I think that the music provided by Nicholas Jar is very, very evocative and stylish. That pounding beat of the reggaeton becomes the movie's anthem, and it almost empowers Emma as a character. I think that the reason why the movie works as well as it does is because of De Girolamo's extremely committed performance, because the rest of the film, aside from her, is very, very uneven. Where Emma is less successful is in its storytelling. The movie starts out very strong. The opening stretch ekes out all the details of what happened with Polo that occurred just before the beginning of the movie. So when we first encounter Emma, various characters hate and blame her for what happened, but we don't know what did happen. And then over the course of this 15 to 20 minute stretch, we get little scenes that fill us in that are cross-cut with Emma's dancing. That's an effective opening that very much gets our curiosity, but that slow burn does turn against the movie the more it progresses, especially because it's so willfully ambiguous. And I know that this is a deliberate, intentional choice. There are many details about the night with Polo that are never quite given to us, and so we just have to kind of fill in the blanks depending on our interpretation of Emma, but it does feel like there's something missing, like we should have more of a picture of what really happened that night. And as the movie progresses and it deliberately tries to obfuscate what Emma is trying to do, you do feel like your attention starts to waver. And yet, despite all those attempts to hide it, I did actually figure out Emma's plan fairly early on into the movie, and that's because, in spite of all the artful filmmaking, if you were to rip the events of this film out of their context and just describe them to someone else, it would sound like a tawdry, trashy Lifetime thriller, because that's sort of what the plot is. You know, it does feel very, very melodramatic in its plotting. It's just simply elevated by the filmmaking and the style. The cinematography is gorgeous in this movie, but it does feel like the rain chases that and the imagery more than the actual storytelling itself. A good example of this is that flamethrower. Yes, it does look exciting and dramatic when someone fires a flamethrower into the air or sets a car on fire like Emma does in this movie. We learned this from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But it also makes absolutely no sense. Why does a dancer go around with a flamethrower? She's just carrying napalm on her back. And maybe I would have just let this slide if it happened once, because obviously it's serving the allegory. You're not meant to take it literally, but Larraín just keeps cutting to it again and again and again, especially when it seems like he's ran out of story. And the more times he does it, the more you think, how is she allowed to go around doing this? How has she not been arrested yet? This is absolutely preposterous. And then there are occasionally moments where the rain goes for a profound image that is more unintentionally hilarious. Fairly early on, there's a moment where in mourning, Emma and Gaston are posed in an embrace, and the camera very slowly tracks backwards to reveal that they are on top of Polo's race car bed. And I understand that's meant to be a moving, beautiful image, but at that point, all I thought was that it was a tragic image by way of Kirk Van Houten. One of the biggest problems that I have with the film is the characters feel very inconsistent. Their motivations are all over the place. And it turns out there is actually an explanation for this. It turns out that Larraín favours a style where he's writing a movie as he's filming it and deliberately holds back information about the story to the actors. And on one level, this sort of makes sense, because if someone's living through these events, they don't know the future, so they're not influencing their decisions based off of that. So arguably, you get more natural, spontaneous performances that way. However, the reason that you tell the performers about their characters in advance is so it can make their performances feel consistent. So this works against the movie, especially when there are great swaths of Emma where it's not immediately apparent what's supposed to be happening, and having these conflicting performances just adds to the confusion. It's going to make audiences feel even more frustrated because they can't really read what's supposed to be happening, and it makes the movie feel disjointed because it probably is. And that right as you go along approach and finding the movie does seem to be apparent in its structure. The way that it starts out, it's very focused on Polo as a character, and I thought that the movie was eventually going to build up towards him, but it turns out that arguably Polo is a MacGuffin. The kid is barely even in the movie. It's half an hour before he actually appears in person, and then even longer than that for him to really become prominent in the movie. But before that point, there's a lot of discussion about Polo and his behaviour. There's an exceptionally disturbing scene where we discover that Polo has killed a cat and stuffed it into a freezer, and the other characters find it and have to dispose of it, and you go, what has gone wrong with Polo? With the incident with his aunt, and now this? He's clearly a very disturbed child. I wonder what that kid's like. And then when we actually meet him, he's just a regular kid, and it doesn't make sense. It feels like, for example, the cat moment is just simply there to shock the audience and doesn't really have much purpose in the wider scheme of things. There's also a moment very early on in the film where Gaston accuses Emma of abusing Polo. It's one isolated line, but it just hangs there, and it's never addressed again whatsoever, and I found that deeply troubling. Like, okay, it's alright to have a little bit of ambiguity over the course of your movie, but you don't just leave something like that hanging. That's a major insinuation, and it goes nowhere. But the problems really start to become apparent in the second half. Once Gaston largely leaves the movie and it focuses upon Emma, I feel like the movie loses sight of what it's trying to be. It does feel like the second half of the movie is lacking a clear sense of purpose and structure behind it, because they're obviously coming up with it as they go along. So it does feel like an episodic, disjointed mass of Emma going on dances or going on dates and having sex. Repeat over and over again, and occasionally you might get a scene of her trying to find Polo. It does feel like Larraín doesn't know where he's supposed to be going, very likely because he doesn't. Apparently he did shoot several different endings for this film. I do think, to his credit, he's picked a good ending for this movie, because without giving anything away, it's a very twisted punchline. And I think that if he knew that was where the story was going to end up, it would have been much better, because obviously he would have worked back from that conclusion. It's a really great ending, but you have to go through such a slog to get to that point. It really is frustrating, because there is probably a better film in Emma, but unfortunately what we're ending up watching is essentially a first draft, with all the lack of refinement that implies. And if the Rain had a better sense of the story that he was trying to tell in advance, he'd also have a better sense of what he was trying to say. Emma is apparently meant to be a commentary on the young generation right now, and judging by this movie, it feels like the Rain simultaneously admires them because Emma is so motivated and self-determined, but also terrified of them because Emma is often framed against her fellow dancers who look like an imposing gang. But if there is meant to be something to be said here, if there is meant to be some kind of political commentary, it feels totally lost in the execution of the movie. There's also something quite gazy about the dance sequences and the way they focus upon Emma's body so heavily, and when you combine that with the way that Emma's lesbian encounters are framed and shot, it does start to feel bordering on close to being uncomfortably leering and fetishistic at times. Emma's a very tricky film to recommend because it's definitely not made for a mainstream audience. This is not a film that holds your hand with its storytelling, nor do I think is it going to become an art house crossover hit. I think that it will definitely find its audience with the art house crowd who seek out more challenging alternative fare, knowing that there is going to be a certain level of ambiguity, they're not going to get all the answers, and that's going to give them something to chew over at the end of the experience, and they'll probably find things to like about it. I personally, however, found it to be hard work. Yes, it does have some gorgeous cinematography. There is a brilliant performance by Mariana de Girolamo, which is why the movie works as well as it does, as well as a good turn by Gael, Garcia, Bernal. But for me personally, I found it to be a lot of striking imagery in desperate need of a story. This needed a lot of refinement. It does feel very weak and all over the place, in my opinion. And I do think that The Rain is probably capable of better than this. I think that the movie overall works as a character piece, but it does not work as a piece of storytelling. Emma is an unusual film that largely succeeds on the energy of Mariana de Girolamo's powerhouse performance that guides the film through every single scene as the tempestuous title character. Despite Emma herself being an often unlikable character, de Girolamo is always compelling in an extremely physical turn, both in terms of the dance sequences and also the eroticism, as we await what destruction and manipulation Emma will enact next. The movie is more successful as a character study than it is a narrative, which withholds key details in a way that is obtuse and frustrating, especially when Emma's plan is fairly obvious when one is paying attention. Emma is provocative thanks to some gorgeous imagery and shocking plot points, but it too often fails to interrogate or expand upon them. Although it culminates in a twisted punchline, Emma feels like a stylish but confused experience, both as a story or a social commentary. If you like this review, then take your flamethrower over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.